The screaming of metal against metal pierced the October morning as Jack Reynolds watched the crane operator struggle with a twisted beam 40 feet above the construction site. Something was wrong with the safety cables, and Jack's massive frame tensed as he recognized the signs that had haunted him for 3 years. The same grinding sound, the same dangerous angle, the same moment when everything could go catastrophically wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Cut the engine. Jack's voice boomed across the job site, a sound that could stop conversations 3 blocks away. Workers scattered as the 6'4" foreman sprinted toward the crane, his work boots pounding against the gravel with surprising speed for a man who weighed 250 pounds. The operator, high in his cab, couldn't hear the warning over the machinery's roar, and Jack knew he had seconds before history repeated itself in the worst possible way. Without hesitation, Jack grabbed the emergency brake lever at the crane's base, his calloused hands finding the mechanism through pure muscle memory. The sudden stop sent vibrations through the steel framework, but the beam held, swaying gently instead of plummeting toward the group of welders below. In that moment of crisis averted, Jack closed his eyes and felt the familiar weight of responsibility that never seemed to lift from his shoulders. 3 years ago, his younger brother Danny had been operating a similar crane when a safety cable snapped. The accident report cited equipment failure and inadequate inspection protocols, but Jack knew the truth was more complicated. Someone should have caught the worn cables during routine maintenance. Someone should have insisted on better safety procedures. Someone should have protected Danny the way Jack always had when they were kids. The guilt of not being there, of not preventing the accident that left 2 children orphaned and Jack struggling to fill an impossible void, colored every decision he made. Now, Jack stood in the sudden quiet of the construction site, surrounded by workers who looked at him with the mixture of respect and unease that his size and intensity often inspired. At 34, Jack had built Reynolds Construction into one of the most trusted companies in Millbrook Valley. But success felt hollow when measured against the cost of the family tragedy that had made it possible. The business that Danny was supposed to inherit had become Jack's burden, just like the children Danny left behind. "You okay, boss?" Mike Torres, Jack's business partner and the only person brave enough to question him during these moments, approached with cautious concern. Mike had been Danny's best friend and understood the weight that Jack carried, even if he couldn't fully share it. Jack nodded, his dark eyes scanning the worksite for any other potential hazards. "Double-check all the equipment before we continue. I want every safety cable inspected personally." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But those who knew him well could hear the underlying tremor of old fears that never quite disappeared. The morning passed without further incident, but Jack found himself distracted by an unusual restlessness that had been building for weeks. It was the anniversary season, the time of year when Danny's death felt most immediate, when the responsibility of raising Tommy and Lily seemed most overwhelming, when the isolation of his chosen life pressed against him like the October fog that rolled down from the mountains surrounding their small Oregon town. Millbrook Valley had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where 3 generations of the same families worked the logging operations and construction sites that formed the backbone of the local economy. It was a community that understood loss and hard work, but it was also a place where a man like Jack, with his imposing presence and fierce protectiveness, often found himself alone even in a crowd. By lunchtime, Jack decided he needed to escape the claustrophobic feeling that had settled over him. He left Mike in charge of the site and drove his battered pickup truck toward the center of town, past the weathered storefronts and the community center, where local events brought together families that seemed to have everything Jack had lost. The Pine Ridge Diner sat at the corner of Main and Elm, a fixture in Millbrook Valley for as long as anyone could remember. The kind of place where coffee was always fresh and conversations carried on for hours. Jack pushed through the diner's front door, the familiar bell announcing his arrival to the handful of other customers scattered throughout the vinyl booths. He chose a table near the back, partly out of habit, and partly because his size made the narrow spaces between tables an obstacle course for other diners. The routine of ordering coffee and studying the menu he had memorized years ago provided a temporary distraction from the weight of his thoughts. It was while he was staring out the window at the changing leaves that Jack first noticed her. A woman sat 3 tables away, her back to him, dark hair falling in waves past her shoulders, Something about her posture caught his attention, the way she held herself perfectly still, as if movement might draw unwanted notice. When she reached for her coffee cup, Jack saw her wince slightly, a small gesture that spoke of pain carefully hidden. The woman turned slightly to look toward the diner's entrance, and Jack caught sight of her profile. She was beautiful in a fragile way that reminded him of a bird that had learned to expect predators. Her skin was pale despite the outdoor work that most people in Millbrook Valley did, and there was a wariness in her green eyes that suggested she was accustomed to watching for danger even in supposedly safe places. Jack found himself studying her with the same attention he brought to construction sites, looking for signs of structural weakness or hidden problems. The way she kept glancing toward the door suggested she was either expecting someone or afraid of who might walk through it. Her clothes were neat but worn, the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of pride despite limited resources. Most telling was the way she held her left arm slightly closer to her body, protecting it in a manner that Jack recognized from his own experience with injuries. When the diner's bell chimed again, the woman's entire body tensed. Jack followed her gaze to see a man entering, someone clearly not from Millbrook Valley based on his expensive clothes and the predatory way he scanned the room. The stranger's eyes locked onto the woman, and Jack watched her carefully place money on her table and gather her purse with movement.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That were just a little too quick, a little too practiced. The woman stood and moved toward the back of the diner, past Jack's table, and he could see now that she was younger than he had initially thought, probably in her late 20s. As she passed, he caught a faint scent of lavender soap and something else, something that reminded him of hospitals and fear. She was heading for the diner's rear exit, the one that led to the alley behind the building, and Jack realized she was trying to escape without being seen. The expensive stranger was making his way through the diner now, his path clearly aimed at intercepting the woman before she could reach the back door. Something in his demeanor, the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation, triggered every protective instinct that Jack possessed. This was the kind of man who took things that didn't belong to him, who used his size and position to hurt people who couldn't fight back. Without conscious decision, Jack rose from his table. At his full height, he dominated the narrow space of the diner, his broad shoulders blocking the stranger's path as effectively as a stone wall. The man looked up at Jack with the startled expression of someone unaccustomed to being physically outmatched, and Jack could see him reassessing the situation with the quick calculation of a predator who had encountered unexpected resistance. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that probably worked in boardrooms and courtrooms but meant nothing in places where men were measured by their actions rather than their bank accounts. Jack didn't move. "You lost." His voice was quiet, but it carried the unmistakable edge of a man who had spent years dealing with people who thought they could push others around through force or intimidation. The question wasn't really about directions, and everyone in the diner understood that. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and Jack could see him weighing his options. He was probably 40 years old, well-dressed, but soft in the way that came from a life spent behind desks rather than doing physical work. Against Jack's 250 pounds of muscle built through years of construction work, he represented no physical threat. But men like this one rarely relied on physical confrontation when they had other tools available. "I'm looking for my wife," the stranger said, his voice now carrying a note of reasonableness that didn't quite mask the underlying threat. "She's not well, has some problems with reality. Family's worried about her." Jack glanced toward the back of the diner, where the woman had paused near the rear exit. Even from across the room, he could see the terror in her eyes, the way her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. This was not a woman suffering from delusions. This was someone who understood exactly how much danger she was in. "Don't see anyone here matching that description," Jack said, his voice still quiet, but now carrying the unmistakable finality of a man who had made his decision. "Might want to try somewhere else." The stranger's facade of reasonableness cracked slightly. "You don't understand the situation here, friend. This is a private family matter." Jack took a single step forward, and the stranger instinctively stepped back. The movement was small, but in the confined space of the diner, it established clearly who held the physical advantage. "I understand perfectly," Jack said, and I'm not your friend." The tension in the diner had risen to the point where other customers were beginning to notice the confrontation. Jack was aware of their attention, but his focus remained entirely on the man in front of him and the woman behind him who was clearly struggling with whether to run or stay. He had learned long ago that bullies depended on isolation, on situations where their victims had no allies and no options. The stranger reached into his jacket, and Jack's hand moved instinctively to intercept him. Years of construction work had given Jack reflexes honed by dangerous situations, and he caught the man's wrist before whatever he was reaching for could be retrieved. The grip was firm enough to make clear that resistance would be both futile and painful. "Hands where I can see them," Jack said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone prepared to enforce his words with action. The stranger's expensive watch pressed against Jack's calloused palm, a symbol of the different worlds they came from, and the different rules they lived by. The man's eyes flickered with a combination of fear and calculation. He was clearly unaccustomed to physical confrontation, but Jack could see him considering his options. Men like this one always had backup plans, ways to get what they wanted even when direct confrontation failed. The threat wasn't ending, it was just being postponed. "This isn't over," the stranger said, pulling his hand free and adjusting his jacket with movements designed to restore his dignity. "Anna belongs with her family, people who care about her well-being." The name hung in the air between them, and Jack filed it away for future reference. Anna, the woman who was still standing by the back door, watching the confrontation with the frozen stillness of someone who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. Her name didn't belong in this man's mouth, spoken with the possessive confidence of ownership rather than affection. The stranger turned and walked back toward the diner's front entrance, his movements controlled but clearly affected by the encounter. Jack watched him go, noting the way he moved, the expensive car visible through the front window, the cell phone that appeared in his hand before he had even cleared the door. This was not a man who gave up easily, and Jack knew that the confrontation was merely the opening move in a larger game. Only when the expensive car had pulled away from the diner did Jack turn his attention to the woman who was still standing by the back door. Anna was watching him with an expression that mixed gratitude with deep wariness, as if kindness itself had become something to be suspicious of. Her green eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from living in constant fear, from never being able to fully relax or trust that safety was anything more than a temporary illusion. Jack approached her slowly, the way he might approach an injured animal that could either flee or attack depending on how threatened it felt. His size, which had been an advantage in dealing with the stranger, now became a potential liability. Women who had been hurt by men often found his physical presence intimidating, regardless of his intentions. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice as gentle as his massive frame would allow. Up close he could see more signs of the fear she carried, the careful way she held herself, the quick glances toward the exits, the tremor in her hands that spoke of adrenaline and old trauma. Anna nodded, but her eyes remained watchful. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Jack replied simply. The truth of it was something he felt in his bones, the same certainty that had driven him to grab the crane's emergency brake earlier that morning. Some situations demanded action regardless of the personal cost, and leaving someone vulnerable to be hurt by those with power was not something his conscience would tolerate. She studied his face as if trying to determine whether his kindness was genuine or another form of manipulation. Jack recognized the look from his own experience with traumatized animals and people who had learned that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. He waited patiently, understanding that rushing would only confirm whatever fears she carried about men who offered help. "I should go," Anna said finally, glancing toward the back door as if the stranger might return at any moment. "He'll be back, and I don't want to cause trouble for anyone else." The resignation in her voice, the automatic assumption that she was the source of the problem rather than its victim, told Jack everything he needed to know about the life she had been living. This was a woman who had been convinced that she was responsible for the violence inflicted upon her, that her presence brought danger to anyone who showed her kindness. "Where will you go?" Jack asked, genuinely curious. Millbrook Valley was a small town surrounded by miles of forest and mountain roads. There weren't many places to hide, and fewer still that would be safe for someone being hunted by a man with resources and determination. Anna's silence was answer enough. She had nowhere to go, no plan beyond the immediate need to escape the latest threat. Jack found himself thinking about Tommy and Lily, about the vulnerability of people who depended on the protection of others, about the responsibility that came with having the strength to help those who couldn't help themselves. "I've got a place," he said, the words emerging before he had fully considered their implications. "Cabin up by Miller's Lake. Quiet, off the main roads. You could stay there while you figure things out." The offer surprised them both. Jack rarely invited anyone to his retreat by the lake, the place where he went to escape the pressures of raising children, and running a business and carrying the weight of his brother's death. It was his sanctuary, the one place where he could let down his guard and exist without the constant awareness of others' needs and expectations. Anna's green eyes searched his face again, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Jack considered the question, aware that she deserved an honest answer. The truth was complicated, tied up in his own history of loss and guilt, in the knowledge that he had failed to protect the people who mattered most to him. But the simple truth was easier to explain. "Because someone should," he said. "And because I can." The answer seemed to resonate with something in Anna's experience. She nodded slowly, as if recognizing a kindness that asked for nothing in return, the kind of help that came without strings or expectations. It was probably a rarity in her life, Jack realized, genuine assistance offered without hidden costs. "I can't pay you," she said, her voice carrying the pride of someone who insisted on earning what she received. "I don't have much money, and I can't promise how long I might need to stay." Jack shook his head, "Not asking for payment, just asking you to be safe." The simplicity of the offer seemed to overwhelm her. Anna's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, as if showing emotion was another form of vulnerability she couldn't afford. Jack understood the response, the way kindness could be more devastating than cruelty for people who had learned to expect nothing but disappointment from others. "Okay," she said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of a new responsibility settling onto his shoulders. He was committed now, not just to providing shelter but to protecting someone who clearly needed protection from forces he didn't yet understand. The stranger's expensive clothes and confident demeanor suggested resources and connections that could make trouble for anyone who interfered with his plans. But Jack had faced trouble before, had dealt with men who thought their money or position gave them the right to hurt others. He thought about Tommy and Lily, about the kind of world he wanted them to grow up in, about the example he wanted to set for children who had already seen too much loss. Sometimes being a protector meant taking risks, accepting challenges that had no guarantee of success. "Follow me," he said, leading Anna toward the diner's back door. "We'll take the back roads to the lake. Safer that way." As they stepped into the October afternoon, Jack felt the familiar sense of purpose that came with taking action to protect someone who needed protection. It was the same feeling that had driven him to build safety protocols into every aspect of his construction business, the same instinct that made him check and recheck every piece of equipment before allowing his workers to use it. The drive to Miller's Lake would give him time to think, to plan, to consider what he was getting himself and his family into by offering sanctuary to a woman being hunted by a man with obvious resources and determination. But as he looked at Anna's careful movements, the way she checked every shadow and assessed every potential threat, Jack knew he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower toward the mountains as they reached their vehicles, and Jack realized that by evening, his quiet life in Millbrook Valley would be permanently changed. He was bringing someone else's troubles into his carefully constructed world, accepting responsibility for a woman whose past was clearly complicated and dangerous. But as Anna looked at him with gratitude that was deeper than words, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in the 3 years since Danny's death. He felt needed in a way that went beyond his role as guardian to his niece and nephew, beyond his position as employer and community member. For the first time in years, Jack Reynolds was choosing to care about someone new, accepting the risks that came with opening his life to another person's pain and possibilities. The gravel road to Miller's Lake wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and cedar, climbing steadily into the foothills where the October mist clung to the mountainsides like smoke. Jack drove slowly, checking his rearview mirror frequently to ensure Anna's borrowed Honda was keeping pace behind his pickup truck. The ancient car wheezed on the steeper grades, and Jack found himself adjusting his speed to accommodate its limitations, a small gesture that somehow felt significant in the context of their unusual arrangement. Anna had insisted on driving separately to the lake, a decision Jack understood even as it complicated their journey. Trust was something that had to be earned gradually, especially from someone whose life had been shattered by the betrayal of those who should have protected her. The independence of having her own transportation represented more than convenience. It was the difference between being a guest and being a prisoner, between choosing to stay and being trapped. As the road narrowed and the trees pressed closer, Jack's mind drifted to the conversation he would need to have with Tommy and Lily when he returned to town that evening. The children were staying with Betty Collins, their elderly neighbor who had become their unofficial grandmother since Danny's death. Betty would have questions about Jack's extended absence, and the children would want to know why their routine was being disrupted. Explaining the presence of a woman in their lives, even temporarily, would require careful consideration of their emotional needs and their recent history of loss. Tommy, at 10 years old, had become fiercely protective of their small family unit. He approached any change with suspicion, having learned through painful experience that disruption often meant loss. The boy who had once been carefree and trusting now watched Jack's every move with the intensity of someone afraid that the most important person in his life might disappear without warning. Adding Anna to their household, even temporarily, would trigger every defense mechanism Tommy had developed since his parents' death. Lily, 7 years old and still carrying the innocent openness that trauma hadn't yet fully touched, would likely embrace Anna's presence with the enthusiasm she brought to everything new. But her acceptance would come with its own challenges, the inevitable questions about why Anna was staying with them, where she had come from, and whether she would become another person who disappeared from their lives without explanation. The lake came into view as they crested the final hill, a mirror of dark water reflecting the late afternoon sky and surrounded by the kind of wilderness that made Millbrook Valley feel like the edge of civilization. Jack's cabin sat on a small promontory jutting into the water, built by his grandfather 40 years earlier as a hunting retreat and expanded over the decades into a comfortable refuge from the demands of town life. It was here that Jack came when the responsibility of raising his brother's children felt overwhelming, when the weight of running a business while grieving became too much to bear. Anna's car pulled up beside his pickup, the engine coughing once before falling silent. Jack watched her emerge from the vehicle, noting how she immediately scanned the area for potential threats or escape routes. Even in this isolated paradise, she couldn't fully relax, and Jack realized that helping her would require more than simply providing physical shelter. She would need time and space to rediscover what safety felt like. The cabin was modest by contemporary standards, but substantial enough to accommodate unexpected guests. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that opened onto a living area dominated by a stone fireplace, and a screened porch that faced the water provided all the amenities necessary for comfortable isolation. Jack had spent countless hours maintaining and improving the structure, partly out of practical necessity and partly because the physical work helped quiet the constant noise in his head. "It's beautiful," Anna said, her voice carrying genuine appreciation as she took in the setting. For a moment, the wariness in her expression softened, replaced by something that might have been wonder. Jack realized it had probably been a long time since she had been able to simply enjoy natural beauty without calculating its tactical advantages or potential dangers. He led her onto the porch, where Adirondack chairs faced the water and a small table held forgotten coffee mugs from his last visit. The silence here was different from the silence in town, filled with the sounds of lapping water and wind through trees rather than the constant low-level tension of human proximity. It was the kind of quiet that encouraged honest conversation, though Jack suspected that honesty was something Anna had learned to ration carefully. "You built this?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth pine railing that bordered the porch. Her fingers traced the joints and curves with the appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship, who could recognize the difference between work done for money and work done for love. Jack nodded, settling into one of the chairs and gesturing for her to join him. "Grandfather started it. My father added the porch. I put in the kitchen renovation 5 years ago. Family project, you could say." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, evoking the generations of Reynolds men who had found peace in this place, who had used it as a sanctuary from whatever troubles the world brought to their doorstep. Anna chose the chair farthest from his, maintaining the careful distance that had become second nature to her. Even here, surrounded by wilderness and miles from the nearest neighbor, she positioned herself with quick access to multiple exit routes. Jack pretended not to notice, understanding that pointing out her defensive positioning would only make her more self-conscious about behaviors that had probably saved her life in the past. "How long have you lived in Millbrook Valley?" she asked, clearly working to establish the parameters of their relationship through conversation. The question was safe enough, the kind of small talk that revealed information without requiring vulnerability. "All my life, except for 2 years in Portland learning construction management," Jack replied. "Family's been here since the 1920s, when my great-grandfather came west looking for logging work. Found it, along with a place that felt like home." He gestured toward the mountains that surrounded the lake. "Hard to leave country like this once it gets into your blood." Anna nodded, though Jack sensed that her experience of place was different from his. Where he saw continuity and belonging, she probably saw isolation and potential entrapment. Geography meant different things to people whose safety depended on mobility, who had learned to think of every location as temporary and potentially compromised. "What about you?" Jack asked gently. "Where did you come from before you ended up in Millbrook Valley?" The question was obviously loaded, touching on whatever circumstances had brought her into conflict with the man from the diner. But Jack hoped his tone made clear that she could share as much or as little as she felt comfortable revealing. Anna was quiet for several minutes, watching the light change on the water as the sun continued its descent toward the mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to edit her own story. "I grew up in Seattle, went to college there. Taught elementary school for a few years before I got married." The past tense hung heavy in the air between them, suggesting that teaching was another thing that had been taken from her. "You miss it?" Jack asked. "Teaching, I mean." He could imagine her in a classroom, working with children who would respond to the gentleness he could sense beneath her defensive walls. There was something in her manner that suggested she understood how to communicate with young people, how to make them feel safe and valued. "Every day," Anna admitted, and for the first time since he had met her, Jack heard something in her voice that wasn't fear or caution. It was grief, pure and simple, the mourning for a life that had been
Interrupted and might never be recoverable. "I loved those kids. Loved watching them discover that learning could be exciting instead of just another obligation." The admission revealed more about her character than any formal introduction could have provided. Anna was someone who had chosen a profession focused on nurturing and protecting children, who had found meaning in helping young people develop confidence and curiosity. The fact that she had been forced to abandon that calling added another layer to the tragedy of whatever had driven her to Millbrook Valley. "There's always a need for good teachers," Jack said carefully, "especially in small towns like this one. If you ever wanted to get back into it, I imagine opportunities could be found." The suggestion was tentative, recognizing that Anna's current circumstances might make any kind of conventional employment impossible. Anna's smile was sad but genuine. "That would require background checks, references, documentation. All the things that become complicated when you're trying to disappear from your previous life." The statement was matter-of-fact rather than self-pitying, acknowledging the practical realities of her situation without dwelling on the unfairness of it. Jack felt a surge of anger at whatever forces had driven a dedicated teacher into hiding, had made it necessary for someone whose instincts were clearly protective to live in constant fear. The man from the diner had represented authority and resources, the kind of power that could make someone's life impossible through legal and financial pressure as much as physical intimidation. The man today, Jack said, choosing his words carefully. He seemed to know you pretty well. The statement was neutral enough to avoid triggering Anna's defenses while still inviting her to share whatever information she felt comfortable revealing. Anna's expression closed down immediately, the brief openness of their conversation about teaching replaced by the guarded wariness that seemed to be her default state. She was quiet for so long that Jack began to think she wouldn't answer at all, but finally she spoke in a voice that barely carried across the distance between their chairs. "Derek Morrison. My ex-husband." The words came out flat and emotionless, as if draining them of feeling was the only way she could manage to say them at all. "We've been divorced for 8 months, but he doesn't seem to accept that the marriage is over." The simple explanation carried implications that made Jack's jaw tighten. Divorced men who pursued their ex-wives across state lines weren't motivated by love or loss. They were driven by the same impulse that made some people destroy things they couldn't control. Derek Morrison was clearly someone who viewed Anna as property rather than a person, who couldn't tolerate the idea that she had found the strength to escape his influence. "How did he find you here?" Jack asked, though he suspected the answer would reveal just how resourceful and determined Anna's pursuer actually was. Men like Derek Morrison didn't give up easily, and they usually had access to tools and connections that made their targets' lives increasingly difficult. Anna shrugged, the gesture carrying a weight of exhaustion that spoke to months or years of being hunted. "Derek has connections everywhere. Law enforcement, private investigators, financial institutions. He knows how to track people, how to make their lives impossible even when they think they've gotten away." Her voice carried the bitter experience of someone who had learned these lessons through painful trial and error. "What does he want?" Jack asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Men who pursued their ex-wives with such determination were rarely motivated by anything healthy or reasonable. "Control," Anna said simply. "Derek can't stand that I left him, that I chose to walk away from everything he offered rather than stay and pretend to be grateful for his version of love." The word love carried particular venom, suggesting that Derek Morrison's affection had been anything but loving in its actual expression. Jack found himself thinking about Tommy and Lily, about the way genuine love manifested in daily life through patience and protection, and putting someone else's needs ahead of your own desires. Whatever Derek Morrison called love was clearly something entirely different, a possession masquerading as affection, control disguised as caring. "There's more to it than just emotional manipulation, isn't there?" Jack asked, reading between the lines of Anna's careful explanations. Women didn't usually flee across multiple states just to escape difficult divorces. They ran when staying meant genuine danger to their physical safety or their lives. Anna was quiet again, and Jack could see her weighing how much truth she could afford to share with someone she had known for less than 4 hours. Trust was clearly something she rationed carefully, having learned through experience that the wrong person with the right information could destroy whatever safety she had managed to build. "Derek is a prosecuting attorney," she said finally. "He has friends in law enforcement, connections in the court system. When I tried to leave the first time, he made sure I understood how many ways he could make my life impossible. False charges, frozen assets, planted evidence. He's very good at making victims look like criminals." The revelation explained Derek's confidence in the diner, his assumption that he could simply claim Anna and walk away with her. Men with connections in the legal system often operated with a sense of impunity, knowing that their word would be taken over that of their victims, that their professional relationships provided a shield against consequences. "But you left anyway," Jack observed, and there was admiration in his voice. It took tremendous courage to run from someone with Derek Morrison's resources and connections, to choose uncertain freedom over the predictable misery of controlled captivity. Anna nodded, and for a moment Jack saw a flash of the strength that had enabled her to escape. "I finally realized that staying would kill me, either literally or in every way that mattered, so I took what little I could carry and left everything else behind." The statement was delivered with the quiet pride of someone who had chosen survival over security, who had risked everything for the chance at something better. "How long have you been running?" Jack asked, gently, beginning to understand the scope of Anna's situation. This wasn't a recent crisis but an ongoing ordeal that had probably consumed months or years of her life. 14 months, Anna replied without hesitation, suggesting that she marked time from the day she had first escaped Derek's control. I've been in 6 different states, worked a dozen different jobs, changed my name twice, but he always finds me eventually. The admission revealed the exhausting reality of Anna's existence, the constant vigilance and perpetual displacement that came with being hunted by someone with resources and determination. Jack tried to imagine living that way, never able to settle anywhere long enough to build relationships or feel secure, always looking over your shoulder for the next threat. What makes this time different? Jack asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. If Derek Morrison had tracked Anna to Millbrook Valley, there was no reason to believe she would be any safer here than she had been in the previous 6 states. Anna's smile was grim. Maybe nothing. Maybe Derek will find a way to force me back, or maybe he'll decide that killing me is easier than continuing to chase me. The possibility was stated matter-of-factly, as if violent death was simply another item on a list of potential outcomes rather than a terrifying possibility. That's not going to happen, Jack said firmly, surprised by the intensity of his own conviction. He had known Anna for less than a day, but the idea of Derek Morrison or anyone else harming her triggered a protective response that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than rational calculation. Anna looked at him with the skeptical expression of someone who had heard similar promises before, usually from people who discovered they couldn't deliver on their good intentions when faced with Derek Morrison's particular brand of systematic intimidation. You don't know what you're up against, she said gently. Derek isn't just some angry ex-husband. He's smart, he's connected, and he's patient. He'll find ways to hurt anyone who helps me. The warning was clearly meant to give Jack an opportunity to reconsider his offer of assistance, to withdraw his help before becoming another casualty in Derek Morrison's campaign of control. But instead of triggering retreat, Anna's explanation only strengthened Jack's resolve. He had spent 3 years carrying guilt over his failure to protect Danny. He wasn't going to fail another person who needed protection. Let me worry about Derek Morrison, Jack said quietly. You just focus on figuring out what you want your life to look like when this is over. The suggestion that the ordeal would eventually end, that Anna's current circumstances were temporary rather than permanent, was clearly something she hadn't allowed herself to consider for a long time. Anna studied his face in the fading light, looking for signs of the false bravado or naive optimism that had probably characterized other offers of help she had received. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because some of the tension left her shoulders and she settled more comfortably into her chair. Why are you doing this? She asked, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. I mean, I'm grateful, but most people wouldn't get involved in something like this. It's dangerous, and it's not your problem. Jack considered the question, aware that Anna deserved an honest answer even if the complete truth was complicated by his own history of loss and guilt. The simple explanation was that helping people in trouble was the right thing to do, but the deeper truth involved his need to prove that he could protect someone when it mattered. That his strength could be used to prevent tragedy rather than simply clean up after it. I have a niece and nephew, he said finally. 10 and 7 years old. Their parents died in an accident 3 years ago, and I've been raising them since then. The explanation touched on his motivation without revealing the full complexity of his feelings about Danny's death and his own responsibility for their family's protection. They're lucky to have you, Anna said, and there was warmth in her voice that suggested she understood something about the challenges of caring for children who had experienced loss. I hope so, Jack replied. But the point is, I want them to grow up in a world where good people help each other, where someone's size or resources or connections don't give them the right to hurt others. If I'm going to teach them those values, I need to live them myself. The answer seemed to resonate with Anna's own understanding of moral responsibility. She nodded slowly, as if recognizing the truth of Jack's words and the sincerity behind them. For the first time since they had met, she seemed to relax completely, allowing herself to believe that his offer of help was genuine and unconditional. "They sound like wonderful kids," she said. "I'd like to meet them sometime if that would be appropriate." The request was tentative, acknowledging that Jack's relationship with his children was separate from his assistance to her, and that she wouldn't presume to insert herself into their family dynamic. "I think they'd like you," Jack said, and he meant it. Tommy's protectiveness might make him wary initially, but both children responded to genuine kindness, and Anna clearly had the temperament that worked well with young people. "But we should probably figure out the immediate situation before we start making long-term plans." Anna nodded, accepting the practical wisdom of Jack's approach while clearly appreciating that he was thinking in terms of long-term possibilities rather than just temporary emergency assistance. The difference was significant, suggesting that his help came without an expiration date or conditions that might make her feel pressured to leave before she was ready. As the sun touched the mountains and the temperature began to drop, Jack stood and moved toward the cabin's front door. "Let me show you around inside, get you settled for the night. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." The offer was simple and practical, focused on Anna's immediate needs rather than the larger questions that would need to be addressed eventually. Anna followed him into the cabin, and Jack was struck by how naturally she moved through the space, as if she understood instinctively how to appreciate simplicity and functionality over luxury. Her fingers traced the smooth wood surfaces with the same appreciation she had shown for the porch railing, recognizing the craftsmanship that had gone into creating a space that was both beautiful and practical. "It's perfect," she said, and Jack could hear the genuine gratitude in her voice. "I can't remember the last time I felt this safe." The admission revealed how rare security had become in her life, how precious the simple gift of a locked door and miles of wilderness buffer felt to someone who had been living in constant fear. Jack showed her the bedroom she could use, the kitchen facilities, the location of towels and extra blankets. The practical details of hospitality felt important, ways of demonstrating that his offer of help extended to thoughtful consideration of her comfort and privacy. Anna listened carefully to his explanations, asking occasional questions that showed she was already thinking about how to contribute to the household rather than simply accepting charity. As Jack prepared to leave for town to collect Tommy and Lily and return for the night, Anna walked him to the door. The evening air was crisp with the promise of frost, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It was the kind of night that made Millbrook Valley feel like a refuge from the complications of the outside world. "Jack," Anna said as he reached his truck. "Thank you for everything. I know this is more than you bargained for when you got up this morning." Her voice carried the weight of genuine appreciation, acknowledgement that his kindness had already changed the trajectory of her day and possibly her life. "Get some rest," Jack replied. "Tomorrow we start figuring out how to make sure Derek Morrison becomes yesterday's problem instead of today's threat." The promise was delivered with quiet confidence, as if Jack's determination alone could transform Anna's circumstances from desperate to hopeful. As Jack drove back toward town, he found himself thinking about the conversation he would need to have with Tommy and Lily, about how to explain Anna's presence in their lives without frightening them or making them feel displaced. The children had already lost so much. They deserved to know that this new development in their family's story was about expansion rather than replacement, about learning to care for others rather than having their own security threatened. The lights of Millbrook Valley appeared as Jack descended from the mountains, and he realized that his quiet life was about to become significantly more complicated. But as he thought about Anna's gratitude and the way she had finally relaxed in the safety of the cabin, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt useful in a way that went beyond his roles as guardian and employer, needed by someone whose survival might literally depend on his willingness to help. The next phase of their unusual relationship would test both his resources and his resolve. But Jack found himself looking forward to the challenge. For the first time since Danny's death, He had found a purpose that felt worthy of the strength and skills he had spent years developing. Anna Cooper needed protection, and Jack Reynolds was exactly the right person to provide it. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of Betty Collins' house as Jack sat across from Tommy and Lily at the worn pine table that had hosted countless family meals over the decades. Betty moved between the stove and counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been feeding children since before Jack was born. Her weathered hands steady as she flipped pancakes and poured fresh orange juice into glasses that had seen better days but still held their charm. Tommy pushed his food around his plate with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions without real interest. His dark eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that made the conversation ahead feel like a negotiation rather than a simple family discussion. At 10 years old, Tommy had developed the hypervigilance of a child who had learned that adult conversations often preceded major disruptions to his carefully ordered world. Lily, in contrast, attacked her pancakes with the enthusiasm she brought to most experiences, syrup decorating her chin and her school clothes in equal measure. Her chatter filled the spaces between Tommy's suspicious silences, a constant stream of observations about friends and teachers and the squirrel family that had taken up residence in Betty's backyard oak tree. But even Lily's natural exuberance couldn't completely mask the underlying tension that had settled over their small family unit since Jack's phone call the previous evening. "So this lady is going to stay at the lake house?" Tommy asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter with the directness that both impressed and worried Jack. The boy had inherited his father Danny's ability to see through adult attempts at misdirection, a skill that served him well in protecting his sister but sometimes made him seem older than his years. Jack nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Her name is Anna, and she's having some troubles that make it unsafe for her to stay in town right now. The cabin gives her a place to figure things out without worrying about someone bothering her." The explanation was truthful without being frightening, acknowledging the reality of Anna's situation without exposing the children to details they weren't equipped to handle. "What kind of troubles?" Lily asked, her spoon suspended halfway between her plate and her mouth. Her blue eyes, so like her mother's, held the earnest curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand the world around her, even when that world included complications she couldn't fully grasp. Betty Collins paused in her breakfast preparations. Her attention focused on Jack's response with the sharp interest of someone who had raised 5 children of her own and understood the delicate balance between honesty and protection that such conversations required. Her presence provided a buffer of stability, the comforting authority of someone who had navigated similar discussions countless times over her 72 years. "Sometimes adults make bad choices about how they treat other people," Jack said, settling on an explanation that acknowledged the existence of difficult realities without creating unnecessary fear. "Anna got married to someone who wasn't kind to her, and even though she's not married to him anymore, he's still trying to cause problems for her." Tommy's expression sharpened with understanding that went beyond his chronological age. "Like how some kids at school pick on other kids, except it's grown-ups." The comparison was both accurate and heartbreaking, revealing that Tommy had already begun to recognize patterns of power and abuse that most children his age were still fortunate enough to avoid. "Something like that," Jack confirmed, impressed by his nephew's ability to distill complex adult dynamics into terms he could understand. "The difference is that Anna is smart and strong enough to get away from the person who was being mean to her. But she needs a safe place to stay while she makes sure he can't find her again." Lily's face scrunched with the concentrated thought she applied to particularly challenging concepts. "Is she scared?" The question carried the empathy that made Lily special, her instinctive concern for others' emotional well-being even when she didn't fully understand their circumstances. "I think she has been scared for a long time," Jack said gently. "But hopefully she won't need to be scared anymore, especially if she has friends who want to help her feel safe." The suggestion that they could all play a role in Anna's recovery was deliberate, giving the children agency in a situation that might otherwise make them feel displaced or threatened. Betty set a fresh plate of pancakes in the center of the table and took her own seat, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Sounds like this Anna could use some kindness," she said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact compassion that had made her a surrogate grandmother to half the children in Millbrook Valley. "Lord knows there's not enough of that in the world these days." Tommy studied his uncle's face with the analytical intensity he brought to problems that required careful consideration. "Are you going to marry her?" The question emerged without preamble, cutting through any attempt at gradual revelation with the efficiency of someone who preferred direct answers to careful diplomatic phrasing. Jack nearly choked on his coffee, unprepared for Tommy's characteristic ability to identify the heart of adult complications with surgical precision. "Tommy, I just met Anna yesterday. People don't get married to someone they've known for one day." The response was technically accurate while avoiding the larger questions about Jack's own romantic prospects and the children's fears about their family structure changing again. "But you like her," Lily observed with the confidence of someone who had developed sophisticated skills at reading adult emotions. "You get the same look you had when you talked about Mama before she went to heaven." The comparison was delivered with innocent directness, but it carried implications that made Jack's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The reference to Jack's late wife caught him off guard, partly because Lily rarely mentioned her mother directly and partly because her observation suggested that his feelings about Anna were more transparent than he had realized. Jack had loved his wife deeply during their brief marriage, and the idea that his interest in Anna might be visible to his perceptive niece created a complexity he wasn't prepared to address. "I think Anna is a good person who deserves help," Jack said carefully. "But right now the most important thing is making sure she's safe and has time to decide what she wants to do with her life. Everything else can wait until the important stuff is figured out." The explanation emphasized priorities while acknowledging that future possibilities existed without making promises about outcomes he couldn't control. Betty reached across the table to pat Jack's hand with the casual affection of someone who had watched him grow up and understood his heart better than he sometimes understood it himself. "The children are just worried about their place in your life," she said with the directness that came from decades of experience with family dynamics. "They need to know that caring about someone new doesn't mean caring about them any less." The observation was both accurate and helpful, providing Jack with the framework he needed to address Tommy and Lily's underlying concerns about displacement and abandonment. Their experience of loss had made them sensitive to any changes that might threaten their security. And Anna's arrival in their lives represented exactly the kind of disruption that triggered their deepest fears. "You two are the most important people in my life," Jack said, reaching across the table to touch each child's hand in turn. "Nothing and nobody will ever change that. Anna staying at the cabin doesn't mean your family is getting smaller or less important. It just means we're sharing some of our safety with someone who needs it right now." Tommy's expression softened slightly, though Jack could see him processing the implications of his uncle's words with the careful analysis he applied to all information that might affect his sister's welfare. "Can we meet her?" he asked finally, the question representing a tentative acceptance of Anna's presence coupled with a desire to evaluate her impact on their family personally. "I'd like that," Jack said, realizing that he genuinely wanted the children to know Anna and for her to experience the warmth and resilience they brought to every situation. "But we need to remember that she's had some very bad experiences with people, so she might be nervous around new faces. It doesn't mean she doesn't like you. It just means she needs time to feel comfortable." Lily nodded with the solemn understanding she applied to important adult explanations. "Like when we got Ranger and he hid under the porch for 3 days before he decided we were nice. The comparison to their rescue dog's initial wariness was both apt and reassuring, providing a familiar framework for understanding Anna's potential reactions. Exactly like that, Jack confirmed, grateful for Lily's ability to find parallels that made complex emotional dynamics accessible. Ranger just needed time to learn that we weren't going to hurt him, and now he's the happiest dog in Millbrook Valley. Sometimes people need the same kind of patience. Betty rose to clear the breakfast dishes, her movements creating the comfortable domestic sounds that had provided the soundtrack to countless family meals in this kitchen. "Why don't you children get ready for school while your uncle and I finish talking?" she suggested, the gentle authority in her voice making it clear that this wasn't really a request. Tommy and Lily obediently gathered their backpacks and lunch boxes, but Tommy paused at the kitchen doorway to look back at Jack with an expression that carried weight beyond his years. "Uncle Jack," he said, his voice carrying the careful formality he used when asking particularly important questions. "What is it, buddy?" Jack replied, recognizing the tone that indicated Tommy was about to share something he had been thinking about carefully. If someone was being mean to Anna the way some people are mean to kids at school, then I'm glad she found someone like you to help her," Tommy said, his words carrying the moral clarity that occasionally emerged from his serious 10-year-old perspective. "Dad always said that people who can help should help, even when it's hard." The reference to Danny's philosophy of community responsibility hit Jack with unexpected force, reminding him that his brother's values lived on in the children he had left behind. Tommy's acceptance of Anna's presence wasn't just about family dynamics. It was about continuing the legacy of compassion and protection that Danny had tried to instill in his son. "Your dad was right about that," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel during a simple breakfast conversation. "He'd be proud of both of you for understanding why it's important to help people who need it." Lily bounded back to give Jack an impulsive hug, her small arms wrapping around his neck with the fierce affection that reminded him daily why Danny's sacrifice in working dangerous jobs to provide for his family had been worth the risk. "I hope Anna likes pancakes," she said seriously. "Betty makes the best ones in the whole world, and maybe they'll help her not be scared anymore." After the children left for school, Jack found himself alone with Betty in the kitchen that had served as the emotional center of their neighborhood for decades. Betty's house had been the gathering place for births and deaths, celebrations and crises, the kind of informal community center that small towns depended on for their social fabric. "You're taking on a lot," Betty said without preamble, her tone carrying the gentle concern of someone who had watched Jack struggle with the responsibilities that had fallen to him after Danny's death. "Not that I disapprove, mind you. Just want to make sure you've thought through what you're getting into." Jack leaned back in his chair, grateful for Betty's willingness to voice the concerns he had been wrestling with since his impulsive offer to help Anna. "I'm not sure anyone can think through something like this completely," he admitted. "But I couldn't walk away from someone who needed help, especially not with Tommy and Lily watching to see what I'd do." Betty nodded with the understanding of someone who had faced similar moral choices throughout her long life. "Children learn more from what we do than what we say," she agreed. "But they also need to know that their security isn't threatened when we extend ourselves to others. You'll need to be careful about that balance." The observation touched on Jack's deepest concerns about bringing Anna into their lives. Tommy and Lily had already experienced the devastating loss of their parents. They didn't need to worry that their uncle's attention might be divided in ways that made them less secure. But they also needed to learn that love and protection weren't finite resources that diminished when shared with others. "What would you do?" Jack asked, genuinely curious about Betty's perspective on the situation. Her years of experience with family dynamics and community relationships had given her insights that Jack valued, especially when facing decisions that affected more than just his own welfare. Betty was quiet for several minutes, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as she considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'd do exactly what you're doing," she said finally. "But I'd also make sure I had backup plans for when things get complicated, because they always do when you're dealing with someone else's troubles." The practical wisdom of Betty's advice resonated with Jack's own instincts about the situation. Anna's problems weren't going to disappear simply because she had found temporary safety, and Derek Morrison's resources meant that the conflict was likely to escalate rather than fade away. Jack needed to be prepared for possibilities that went beyond simple hospitality. "What kind of backup plans?" Jack asked, recognizing that Betty's experience with community crises had probably taught her valuable lessons about preparing for escalation. "Legal advice for one thing," Betty said promptly. "If this Derek fellow is as connected as you've suggested, you'll need someone who understands how to navigate the system when it's being used against you. And security measures for the children, ways to make sure their routines don't get disrupted if things get ugly." The suggestions were sobering reminders that Jack's decision to help Anna could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate relationship. Tommy and Lily's welfare had to remain his primary concern, which meant planning for scenarios where Anna's presence might create dangers that threatened their safety. Frank Harrison might be someone to talk to. Betty continued, referring to the local sheriff who had earned respect throughout Millbrook Valley for his combination of professional competence and personal integrity. "Frank's seen enough domestic violence cases to understand what you're dealing with, and he doesn't much care for outsiders who come into his county thinking they can push people around." The suggestion made sense on multiple levels. Sheriff Harrison's involvement would provide official oversight of Anna's situation while also establishing a record of Derek Morrison's behavior that might prove useful if legal intervention became necessary. More importantly, Frank's support would help legitimize Anna's presence in the community and potentially discourage Derek from pursuing tactics that relied on Anna's isolation. Jack finished his coffee and prepared to leave for the construction site, his mind already working through the practical steps he would need to take to ensure that his offer of help to Anna didn't create unintended consequences for his family. The day ahead would require careful attention to his business responsibilities while also beginning the process of integrating Anna's needs into their established routines. "Thanks, Betty," he said, giving the elderly woman a hug that conveyed his gratitude for her steady presence in their lives. "For everything. I don't know what we'd do without you." Betty's smile carried the warmth of someone who had found purpose in caring for others throughout her long life. "You'd manage just fine," she said with characteristic modesty. "But I'm glad I can help. That's what community is for." The drive to the construction site gave Jack time to consider the conversations he would need to have that day, starting with Mike Torres and extending to the workers who depended on Reynolds Construction for their livelihoods. Anna's presence in his life was bound to generate curiosity and speculation, especially in a town where everyone's business quickly became everyone else's concern. The worksite buzzed with its usual morning energy as Jack arrived, the sound of heavy machinery and shouted instructions creating the familiar symphony of productive labor. Mike was waiting by the trailer that served as their on-site office, his expression carrying the mixture of concern and curiosity that meant he had questions about Jack's early departure the previous day. "Everything okay?" Mike asked without preamble, his direct approach reflecting the friendship that had developed between them over years of working together through Danny's death and the challenges of building a business while raising children. Jack appreciated Mike's straightforward question, preferring honest inquiry to the careful speculation that would probably characterize other conversations throughout the day. "Had to help someone with a problem," he said, settling on an explanation that was truthful without revealing details that weren't his to share. Mike studied Jack's face with the analytical attention he brought to structural problems, looking for signs of stress or distraction that might affect their work. "The kind of problem that's going to cause complications for the rest of us?" he asked, demonstrating the practical concerns of someone who understood that Jack's personal decisions could have professional consequences. "Possibly," Jack admitted, appreciating Mike's willingness to address potential difficulties directly rather than pretending they didn't exist. "But nothing that should affect the business as long as we're smart about how we handle things." The answer seemed to satisfy Mike's immediate concerns while acknowledging that the situation wasn't entirely straightforward. Mike nodded and moved on to discussing the day's work schedule, but Jack could see him filing the conversation away for future reference. If complications did arise, Mike would be prepared to provide the kind of support that good partnerships depended on. The morning progressed with the steady rhythm of construction work, the physical demands of building providing a welcome distraction from the emotional complexities that had entered Jack's life. But even as he focused on lumber measurements and foundation levels, part of his attention remained focused on Anna, wondering how she was adjusting to the solitude of the lake house and whether Derek Morrison was already working to track her latest location. During the lunch break, Jack drove back to the cabin to check on Anna and bring her some supplies from town. The 20-minute journey through the mountains gave him time to transition from his role as employer and contractor to his new responsibility as protector and friend, roles that required different skills and different kinds of attention. Anna was sitting on the cabin's porch when Jack arrived, a book open in her lap and a mug of coffee cooling on the table beside her chair. She looked more rested than she had the previous day, though Jack could see that she still maintained the careful awareness of someone accustomed to monitoring her surroundings for potential threats. "Good morning," she said, her smile carrying genuine warmth that suggested she had spent a peaceful night in the safety of the isolated cabin. "I hope you don't mind that I made myself at home with the coffee." Jack waved away her concern, pleased to see that Anna felt comfortable enough to use the cabin's amenities without asking permission. "That's exactly what it's there for," he said, settling into the chair beside hers. "How did you sleep?" Anna's expression softened with something that might have been wonder. "Better than I have in months," she admitted. "I actually slept through the night without waking up to check the locks or listen for cars in the driveway. I'd forgotten what that felt like." The simple statement revealed the depth of exhaustion that Anna had been carrying, the cumulative effect of months spent in a state of hypervigilance that had prevented genuine rest. Jack felt a surge of satisfaction at knowing that his offer of sanctuary had already provided tangible benefits, that Anna was beginning to experience what safety actually felt like. "I brought some groceries," Jack said, gesturing toward the bags in his truck. "And I thought maybe this afternoon you might like to meet Tommy and Lily if you're feeling up to it. They're curious about you, and I think you'd enjoy them." Anna's expression brightened with interest, but Jack could also see a flicker of nervousness that suggested she was concerned about making a good impression on the children who were so important to Jack. "I'd love to meet them," she said, "but I want to make sure they're comfortable with me being here. I know this situation is probably confusing for them." The consideration Anna showed for Tommy and Lily's emotional needs impressed Jack and reinforced his growing conviction that his instincts about her character had been accurate. Someone who prioritized children's welfare even while dealing with her own crisis was exactly the kind of person he wanted in their lives, regardless of how their relationship developed. "They're resilient kids," Jack said. "But they've also been through a lot of loss, so they're protective of what they have. Just be yourself, and they'll see what I see." Anna tilted her head slightly, curiosity evident in her expression. "And what do you see?" she asked, the question carrying genuine interest rather than fishing for compliments. Jack considered the question seriously, aware that his answer would reveal something about his own developing feelings as well as his assessment of Anna's character. "I see someone who's been hurt but hasn't let it make her bitter," he said finally. "Someone who's strong enough to keep fighting for what's right even when the odds are against her. Someone who cares about other people even when she has every reason to focus only on her own survival." The assessment clearly moved Anna, who looked away toward the lake as if she needed a moment to process his words. When she looked back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said simply. "I haven't felt like any of those things for a very long time." "Maybe it's time to start," Jack suggested gently. "You're safe here, Anna. Safe enough to remember who you are underneath all the fear and running. Safe enough to start thinking about what you want instead of just what you need to avoid." The possibility of moving beyond survival mode to actually planning for a future was clearly something Anna hadn't allowed herself to consider for months. The idea that she might have choices again, that her life could include possibilities beyond mere endurance, seemed both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who had spent so long reacting to crises that proactive planning felt like a foreign concept. "We'll figure it out together," Jack said, the promise emerging before he had fully considered its implications. But as soon as the words were spoken, he knew they were true. Whatever Anna's future held, he wanted to be part of helping her discover it. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across Miller's Lake when Jack's pickup truck wound down the familiar gravel road, carrying two passengers who pressed their faces to the windows with the intense curiosity that children brought to new adventures. Tommy sat behind Jack, his serious expression softened by genuine interest in the landscape they were passing through. While Lily bounced in her booster seat with barely contained excitement about meeting the mysterious Anna who had captured their uncle's attention. Anna stood on the cabin's porch as they approached, her hands smoothing her borrowed sweater with the nervous energy of someone who understood that this meeting would determine her place in the complicated family dynamic that Jack had created through love and loss and stubborn determination. She had spent the morning cleaning the already spotless cabin and preparing simple snacks, channeling her anxiety into productive activity while rehearsing conversations that she hoped would convince two grieving children that she posed no threat to their carefully protected world. Jack parked beside the cabin and turned to address his passengers with the gentle authority that had guided them through 3 years of shared healing. "Remember what we talked about," he said, his voice carrying the mixture of encouragement and caution that preceded important family interactions. "Anna might be a little nervous about meeting new people, so we'll take things slow and let her get comfortable with us." Tommy nodded with the solemnity he brought to situations that required mature behavior, while Lily's enthusiasm dimmed only slightly as she processed the reminder that their new friend needed careful handling. Both children had learned through experience that adults who seemed fragile often carried invisible wounds that required the same gentle treatment they would give to injured animals. Anna descended the porch steps as they climbed out of the truck, her smile genuine but tentative as she approached the small group that represented Jack's most precious responsibilities. Up close, Tommy could see the fading bruises on her wrists that she hadn't quite managed to conceal, evidence of the troubles that had brought her into their uncle's protective sphere. Lily noticed Anna's careful movements, the way she positioned herself with clear access to retreat, behaviors that reminded her of the stray cats that occasionally appeared in their neighborhood. "Anna, I'd like you to meet Tommy and Lily," Jack said, his hand resting on each child's shoulder in a gesture that conveyed both presentation and protection. "Tommy's 10 and Lily's 7, and they're the best kids in Millbrook Valley, though I might be slightly biased." Anna crouched to bring herself closer to the children's eye level, a movement that demonstrated her understanding of how to communicate with young people without intimidating them through adult height and authority. "It's wonderful to meet you both," she said, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her effective in her former classroom. "Your uncle has told me so many good things about you." Lily stepped forward with the social confidence that made her popular among her classmates, extending her hand with the formal politeness that Betty Collins had drilled into both children. "Nice to meet you too," she said, her blue eyes bright with curiosity. "Uncle Jack says you used to be a teacher. What grade did you teach?" The question provided Anna with safe conversational ground, allowing her to share something positive about her past without venturing into the darker territories that had defined her recent experience. "Third grade," she replied, accepting Lily's handshake with the appropriate seriousness. "Children about your age, actually. I loved helping them discover that learning could be fun instead of just work." Tommy remained slightly behind his sister, his protective instincts making him cautious about accepting new people into their family circle. But Anna's mention of teaching sparked his interest, since education had become increasingly important to him as he worked to understand the complex world that had claimed his parents. "What was your favorite subject to teach?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral but engaged. Anna considered the question with the thoughtfulness that suggested she understood Tommy's wariness and respected his need to evaluate her carefully. "I loved teaching science," she said finally. "Especially the kind of experiments where you get to see how things work instead of just reading about them in books. There's something magical about watching children's faces when they finally understand why something happens the way it does." The answer clearly resonated with Tommy, whose analytical mind thrived on understanding the mechanics of the world around him. Jack could see his nephew's defensive walls beginning to lower as he recognized someone who shared his appreciation for logical thinking and practical knowledge. Would you like to see the cabin? Jack suggested, sensing that movement and activity would help ease the initial awkwardness of their introduction. Anna's been staying here while she figures out her next steps, and I thought you might enjoy showing her some of your favorite spots around the lake. Lily immediately claimed the role of tour guide, her natural enthusiasm overcoming any lingering shyness as she led Anna toward the water's edge where a small dock extended into the clear mountain lake. This is where we come fishing in the summer, she explained, pointing to the weathered planks that had supported countless family adventures. Uncle Jack taught us how to bait hooks and everything, even though it's kind of gross. Anna followed Lily's animated explanations with genuine interest, asking questions that demonstrated her engagement with the children's experiences rather than polite adult tolerance. She admired the collection of smooth stones that Lily had gathered over multiple visits, listened carefully to Tommy's explanation of the lake's geological formation, and seemed genuinely impressed by their knowledge of local wildlife. As they walked along the shoreline, Anna found herself relaxing in a way that surprised her. The combination of natural beauty and innocent conversation created a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the tension and fear that had defined her interactions for months. These children, with their openness and curiosity, reminded her of why she had chosen teaching as her profession, why working with young people had brought her such joy before Derek Morrison had systematically destroyed every aspect of her life that provided meaning and satisfaction. Anna, Tommy said as they paused beside a fallen log that served as a natural bench, Uncle Jack says you had to leave your old home because someone was being mean to you. His directness was characteristic, cutting through adult euphemisms to address the reality that everyone was carefully avoiding. Anna glanced at Jack, who nodded encouragingly, giving her permission to share whatever level of truth she felt comfortable revealing. That's right, she said, settling onto the log beside Tommy while Lily continued her exploration of the water's edge. Sometimes adults make bad choices about how they treat other people, and when that happens, the person being hurt has to find somewhere safe to figure out what to do next. Tommy processed this explanation with the serious consideration he applied to complex problems. Are you going to stay here? He asked, the question carrying both curiosity and something that might have been hope. Despite his initial wariness, Anna's genuine interest in their lives and her respectful treatment of their family dynamics had begun to win his approval. I don't know yet, Anna answered honestly. That depends on a lot of things that are still being figured out. But I'm grateful that your uncle was kind enough to give me a safe place while I work through everything. The response acknowledged the uncertainty of her situation while expressing appreciation for the family's generosity. Lily abandoned her stone collection and rejoined the group, her attention focused on Anna with the intensity she brought to particularly interesting subjects. Do you miss teaching? She asked, settling cross-legged on the ground with the casual grace of childhood. The question touched something deep in Anna's emotional landscape, bringing tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. Every day, she admitted, her voice thick with the grief of losing not just a job but a calling that had defined her identity. I loved my students, loved watching them grow and learn and become excited about discovering new things. Maybe you could teach again here, Lily suggested with the optimistic problem-solving that characterized her approach to difficulties. Millbrook Valley always needs good teachers, and you seem really nice. The innocent proposal carried implications that made Anna's heart flutter with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. Jack watched this exchange with growing amazement at how naturally Anna connected with his children, how effortlessly she navigated the delicate balance between engaging with their questions and respecting their emotional boundaries. Her responses demonstrated both genuine caring and professional skill, the combination that had probably made her exceptional in the classroom before Derek Morrison's campaign of intimidation had forced her to abandon her career. As the afternoon progressed, the initial formality of their meeting dissolved into comfortable interaction. Anna helped Lily build an elaborate stone sculpture while discussing the engineering principles that would keep it stable. She listened with apparent fascination as Tommy explained the differences between various types of pine trees, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite adult attention. When Jack suggested they move back to the cabin for the snacks Anna had prepared, both children accompanied her eagerly, their initial caution replaced by the beginning of genuine affection. Anna had passed their preliminary evaluation, demonstrating that she could be trusted with their uncle's attention without threatening their own security. The kitchen of the cabin filled with the comfortable sounds of family interaction as Anna served juice and homemade cookies, while the children shared stories about school and friends and the various adventures that filled their days. Jack found himself watching the scene with a mixture of gratitude and growing hope, seeing his fractured family beginning to heal in ways he hadn't dared to imagine. Anna makes really good cookies, Lily announced with the authority of someone who considered herself an expert on baked goods. Almost as good as Betty's, and that's saying a lot because Betty's are famous in our whole town. The comparison was clearly intended as the highest possible compliment, and Anna accepted it with the grace of someone who understood the significance of earning approval from children who had learned to be careful about extending their trust. "Thank you," she said warmly. "I learned from my grandmother, who always said that the secret ingredient in any recipe was making it with love for the people who would be eating it." Tommy, who had been quietly observing the interaction between Anna and his sister, finally spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of his concerns. He asked, his 10-year-old directness exposing the adult complications that everyone had been carefully avoiding. The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications about the future of their family dynamic and the role that Anna might play in their carefully reconstructed lives. Jack felt his breath catch as he realized that Tommy's inquiry went beyond simple curiosity to address the fundamental changes that Anna's presence might bring to their established relationships. Anna looked directly at Tommy, recognizing that his question deserved a serious answer despite his young age. "I hope I can be a good friend to all of you," she said carefully. "Your uncle has been incredibly kind to me when I really needed help, and I want to make sure that kindness doesn't cause problems for your family." The response demonstrated Anna's understanding of the delicate position she occupied in their lives, her awareness that any romantic development with Jack would need to enhance rather than threaten the children's relationship with their guardian. Tommy seemed satisfied with her acknowledgement of these complexities, nodding with the approval of someone whose concerns had been heard and addressed. As evening approached and Jack prepared to drive the children back to town for school the next day, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from tentative politeness to genuine warmth. Lily hugged Anna goodbye with the spontaneous affection she showed to people who had earned her approval, while Tommy offered a more reserved but sincere expression of gratitude for the afternoon. "Will we see you again soon?" Lily asked as they gathered their jackets, her question carrying the hope of someone who had found a new friend worth keeping. Anna glanced at Jack, uncertain about making promises regarding future meetings when her own situation remained so precarious. "I'd like that very much," she said finally. "But we'll have to see what happens with all the grown-up complications I'm trying to work through." After the children were settled in the truck and Jack had started the engine, Tommy rolled down his window to address Anna one final time. "I think you're good for Uncle Jack," he said, with the matter-of-fact assessment that characterized his most important observations. "He smiles more when you're around." The comment left Anna standing on the porch long after the truck had disappeared around the bend. Tommy's words echoing in her mind as she considered the possibility that her presence might be bringing joy rather than just complications to Jack's life. For someone who had spent months believing that she only brought danger and trouble to those who showed her kindness, the idea that she might actually contribute something positive to a family's happiness was both wonderful and terrifying. 3 days later, Derek Morrison arrived in Millbrook Valley with the subtle menace of a predator who had finally located his prey. He checked into the town's only hotel under an assumed name, rented a nondescript sedan, and began the systematic surveillance that had served him well in tracking Anna across 6 states and 14 months of determined pursuit. Derek's approach to hunting his ex-wife had evolved into a sophisticated methodology that combined legal intimidation with psychological warfare, financial pressure with social manipulation. He understood that Anna's greatest weakness was her reluctance to involve innocent people in their conflict, her protective instincts that made her flee rather than fight when her presence brought danger to those who had shown her kindness. The Pine Ridge Diner provided Derek with an excellent observation post, allowing him to study the rhythms of Millbrook Valley while gathering information about the local power structures and social dynamics that might prove useful in his campaign to reclaim Anna. He identified key figures in the community, assessed potential allies and obstacles, and began developing the strategic approach that would either convince Anna to return voluntarily or force her compliance through more direct methods. Sheriff Frank Harrison became aware of Derek's presence through the network of informal observation that characterized small-town law enforcement. The stranger's expensive clothes and careful questions about local residents triggered the protective instincts that Frank had developed through 20 years of keeping peace in a community where everyone's business was everyone else's concern. Frank's conversation with Jack that evening took place in the parking lot of the construction company's office, a setting that provided privacy while allowing both men to maintain the casual appearance of neighbors discussing routine matters. But the urgency in Frank's voice made clear that their discussion involved serious concerns about community safety. "He's asking about you specifically," Frank reported, his weathered face grim with the worry that came from recognizing professional danger. "Claims to be a lawyer investigating some kind of fraud case, but his questions are too personal for legitimate legal inquiry. Wants to know about your family, your habits, your property holdings." Jack felt his stomach tighten with the cold certainty that Derek Morrison's arrival meant the end of Anna's brief period of safety and the beginning of a more dangerous phase of their conflict. "How long has he been in town?" Jack asked, already calculating the security measures he would need to implement to protect Anna and the children. "2 days that I know of," Frank replied, "probably longer if he was being careful about staying invisible." "This isn't his first rodeo, Jack. He knows how to work a community, how to identify pressure points and exploit them. You need to be very careful about how you handle this." The warning carried implications that went beyond personal safety to encompass the broader impact that Derek's campaign might have on Jack's business, his custody of Tommy and Lily, and his standing in the community. Men with Derek Morrison's resources and connections didn't limit themselves to direct confrontation when indirect methods could achieve their goals with less risk. "What are my legal options?" Jack asked, though he suspected that conventional
law enforcement might be inadequate against someone who understood how to manipulate the system from the inside. Frank's expression grew even more serious. "Limited, unless he does something overtly illegal. Being in town asking questions isn't a crime, even when we know his motives aren't good. But I can keep an eye on him. Make sure he understands that his activities are being monitored." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering security protocols for the children, communication procedures for emergencies, and contingency plans for scenarios ranging from legal harassment to physical violence. By the time they parted, Jack had a clear understanding of the challenges ahead and the resources available to meet them. The drive to Miller's Lake that night took on a different character, weighted with urgency and the knowledge that Anna's sanctuary was no longer secure. Jack's headlights cut through the mountain darkness as he considered how to explain Derek's arrival without destroying the fragile sense of safety that Anna had begun to develop. Anna was waiting on the porch when Jack arrived, her silhouette visible against the warm light spilling from the cabin's windows. She had heard the trucks approach from a considerable distance, and her posture suggested that she had been watching the road with the hypervigilance that never quite disappeared, even in moments of relative peace. "He's here, isn't he?" Anna said before Jack had fully emerged from his vehicle. Her voice carried resignation rather than surprise, as if Derek's arrival had been inevitable and she had been preparing herself for this moment throughout their brief respite. Jack nodded, settling beside her on the porch steps with the heavy awareness that their conversation would determine the next phase of Anna's fight for freedom. "Frank Harrison saw him in town, asking questions about me and my family. He's using some story about investigating fraud, but it's obviously reconnaissance." Anna absorbed this information with the calm that came from months of living with constant threat, though Jack could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands clenched into fists. "How long do you think we have before he figures out where I am?" she asked, her practical focus on logistics rather than emotional reaction demonstrating the survival skills she had developed. "Not long," Jack admitted.
Derek's smart and he has resources. If he's here, it means he's already narrowed down your location to Millbrook Valley. The cabin might buy us a few days, but not much more than that. The assessment hung between them like a challenge, forcing both to confront the reality that their growing relationship was about to be tested by forces neither of them could fully control. Anna's safety depended on Jack's willingness to risk everything he had built for the sake of protecting someone he had known for less than a week. Jack's future happiness might depend on Anna's courage to stop running and start fighting back against the man who had systematically destroyed her life. "I should leave," Anna said quietly, the words carrying the weight of someone who had made similar decisions countless times before. "Before Derek's attention brings trouble to you and the children. I won't be responsible for putting Tommy and Lily in danger." Jack turned to face her fully, his expression carrying the determined certainty that had guided his most important decisions since Danny's death. "You're not leaving," he said firmly. "We're going to figure this out together and we're going to find a way to make Derek Morrison yesterday's problem instead of tomorrow's threat." The promise represented more than gallant protection. It embodied Jack's commitment to the kind of man he wanted to be, the example he wanted to set for his children, and the life he wanted to build with the remarkable woman who had transformed his understanding of what family could become. Anna looked into Jack's eyes and saw something she had almost forgotten existed: unwavering support from someone strong enough to provide it and caring enough to offer it without conditions or expectations. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that running might not be her only option, that standing and fighting might be possible with the right ally beside her. "Then teach me," she said softly, her voice carrying new resolve. "Teach me what real love feels like, Jack. Because I think I'm finally ready to learn." The gentle giant reached for her hand, and in that simple gesture two broken people began the process of becoming whole together, ready to face whatever challenges their love would bring. The morning mist rolled across Miller's Lake like smoke from some distant fire, creating an ethereal landscape that seemed to exist between worlds. Anna stood at the kitchen window of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, watching the sun struggle to penetrate the gray veil that had settled over the water during the night. 3 weeks had passed since Derek's arrival in Millbrook Valley. 3 weeks of careful planning and strategic positioning that had transformed their defensive posture from reactive hiding to proactive confrontation. Jack emerged from the bedroom, his massive frame filling the doorway as he stretched muscles that had grown accustomed to sleeping on the cabin's narrow couch. The living arrangement had evolved naturally, with Anna claiming the bedroom while Jack maintained his protective presence in the main living area. Close enough to respond to any threat but respectful of the boundaries that Anna still needed to maintain her sense of safety and autonomy. The transformation in Anna over those 3 weeks had been remarkable to witness. The constant vigilance remained, but it had evolved from paralyzing fear into tactical awareness. She moved with purpose now, her actions guided by strategic thinking rather than panic-driven flight instincts. The woman who had been reduced to cowering in diners and fleeing across state lines had rediscovered the strength that had once made her an effective teacher and community member. "Frank called last night after you went to sleep," Jack said, pouring himself coffee from the pot Anna had prepared. "Derek's been asking more specific questions around town, trying to find out about property ownership and rental agreements. He's definitely narrowing his search." Anna nodded, unsurprised by the intelligence report. Derek's methodology was predictable in its thoroughness, a systematic approach that had served him well in his legal career and his campaign of stalking. But predictability could be turned into vulnerability with the right preparation and the right allies. "How many people know I'm here?" Anna asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Millbrook Valley was the kind of community where secrets were difficult to maintain, especially when those secrets involved the town's most eligible bachelor providing sanctuary to a mysterious woman with obvious troubles. "More than I'd like, fewer than it could be," Jack replied, diplomatically. "Frank's been working to control the information flow, but people talk. The important thing is that the people who know are also the people who understand why secrecy matters." The network of support that had developed around Anna's presence had surprised them both with its depth and sophistication. Betty Collins had emerged as an unofficial coordinator, using her decades of community relationships to identify allies and potential security risks. Mike Torres had quietly reorganized work schedules to ensure that Jack could maintain his protective presence without abandoning his business responsibilities. Even the local pastor had offered the church as a sanctuary if circumstances required it. Anna's integration into this protective network had been gradual but genuine. She had begun helping Betty with meal preparation for community events, using her teaching skills to tutor struggling students at the library, and gradually becoming known as someone who contributed value rather than simply requiring assistance. The transformation from mysterious stranger to community member had been crucial in establishing the social support that would be necessary for long-term safety. "Tommy called yesterday while you were working," Anna said, settling into the chair across from Jack at the small kitchen table. "He wanted to know if I'd be there when he and Lily come up this weekend. I think he's gotten attached to our science experiments." The mention of the children brought a smile to Jack's weathered features. Tommy and Lily's acceptance of Anna had exceeded his most optimistic expectations, evolving from polite tolerance to genuine affection with remarkable speed. Anna's teaching background had proven invaluable in connecting with them, providing educational activities that challenged their minds while also creating shared experiences that strengthened their emerging family bonds. "He's been talking about you at school," Jack admitted. According to Betty, he told his teacher that his uncle's friend was helping him understand why leaves change colors in the fall. Mrs. Peterson was impressed by his sudden interest in photosynthesis and chlorophyll breakdown. The casual reference to Anna as his uncle's friend represented significant progress in Tommy's emotional landscape. The boy, who had been fiercely protective of their small family unit, had begun to see Anna as an addition rather than a threat, someone who enhanced rather than competed with his relationship with Jack. Anna's expression softened with the pleasure that came from knowing she was making a positive difference in the children's lives. "Tommy has a brilliant mind," she said. "He just needs someone to explain things in ways that connect to what he already knows and cares about." All good teaching is really about building bridges between new information and existing understanding. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive sound of a vehicle approaching on the gravel road that led to the cabin. Both Jack and Anna tensed automatically, their bodies responding to potential threat with the learned vigilance that had become second nature. But the engine sound was familiar, and Jack relaxed as he recognized the rumble of Frank Harrison's official patrol vehicle. Sheriff Harrison emerged from his car with the deliberate movements of someone who understood that his presence at the cabin represented escalation in their ongoing conflict with Derek Morrison. Frank's expression carried the grim satisfaction of a law enforcement officer who had finally gathered enough evidence to take action against a threat to his community's safety. "Good morning," Frank said, accepting Jack's invitation to join them at the kitchen table. "I hope you're both ready for some news, because we've got developments that change everything about your situation." Anna straightened in her chair, prepared for information that might require immediate action or significant changes to their carefully constructed defensive strategy. The past 3 weeks had been devoted to gathering intelligence and building alliances, but she had always known that eventually their conflict with Derek would move beyond preparation into direct confrontation. "Derek made a mistake yesterday," Frank continued, pulling a small recording device from his jacket pocket. "A big one. He approached Mrs. Peterson at the elementary school, claimed to be investigating child endangerment charges against you, Jack. Wanted to know about Tommy and Lily's behavior, their home situation, whether they'd mentioned anything about inappropriate adults in their lives." The implications of Derek's inquiry sent a chill through Jack that had nothing to do with the October morning air. Targeting the children represented an escalation in Derek's campaign that crossed lines even Jack's worst-case scenario planning hadn't anticipated. The idea that Derek would use Tommy and Lily's welfare as weapons in his pursuit of Anna triggered protective instincts that went beyond rational calculation. "Mrs. Peterson is nobody's fool," Frank said with obvious satisfaction. She recognized the inquiry as suspicious and inappropriate, especially since Derek couldn't provide proper credentials or official authorization for his investigation. More importantly, she recorded the entire conversation on her phone. Frank activated the recording device, and Derek Morrison's voice filled the small kitchen with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to using authority and intimidation to achieve his goals. But as the conversation progressed, Derek's frustration became apparent. His carefully controlled professional demeanor cracking as Mrs. Peterson refused to provide the information he demanded. "You can hear him threatening legal action against the school district if they don't cooperate with his investigation," Frank noted. but you can also hear him admitting that he has no official standing to make such demands. He's essentially confessing to attempting to obtain confidential information about children through fraudulent means. Anna listened to her ex-husband's voice with a mixture of revulsion and strategic interest. Derek's desperation was becoming apparent, his usual sophisticated approach degrading into the kind of crude intimidation that revealed the true nature beneath his professional facade. Men who threatened children were usually men who had exhausted their more subtle options. "What does this mean legally?" Jack asked, though his tone suggested he was more interested in practical implications than legal technicalities. The protection of Tommy and Lily had always been his primary concern, and Derek's decision to target them transformed their conflict from personal dispute to family emergency. "It means we can finally take official action," Frank replied with obvious satisfaction. "Fraudulent representation to a school official, attempted violation of student privacy rights, harassment of a public employee. None of these are major felonies individually, but together they establish a pattern of behavior that gives us grounds for a restraining order and possibly criminal charges." The possibility of legal protection represented more than just tactical advantage. It offered Anna the prospect of legitimizing her flight from Derek's abuse, of transforming her from fugitive to protected victim in the eyes of the law. For someone who had spent months feeling like a criminal simply for seeking safety, the validation of official support carried emotional weight beyond its strategic value. "There's more," Frank continued, his expression growing even more serious. "Derek's been staying at the hotel under a false name, paying cash for everything, using what appears to be fraudulent identification. When I ran his real credentials through the system yesterday, some interesting flags came up." Frank consulted his notebook with the methodical attention to detail that characterized professional law enforcement work. "Turns out Derek Morrison has been the subject of internal investigations in 3 different jurisdictions. Abuse of prosecutorial authority, witness intimidation, questionable relationships with law enforcement personnel. Nothing that resulted in charges, but enough to establish a pattern." The revelation that Derek's professional reputation was less pristine than Anna had believed provided crucial context for understanding why he had been so determined to prevent her from speaking publicly about their relationship. Men whose careers depended on public trust couldn't afford to have their private conduct subjected to scrutiny, especially when that conduct involved systematic abuse of their intimate partners. "I've been in contact with prosecutors in those other jurisdictions," Frank said. "They're very interested in what we've uncovered here, especially the recording of Derek's conversation with Mrs. Peterson. Apparently, this kind of behavior fits a pattern they've been trying to document for years." Anna felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope that her ordeal might actually end rather than simply continue indefinitely. The possibility that Derek might face real consequences for his actions, that his professional standing might be damaged by his personal conduct, offered a path to resolution that didn't require her to spend the rest of her life in hiding. "What happens next?" Anna asked, her voice steady despite the emotional turbulence that Frank's revelations had created. The woman who had been running for 14 months was ready to consider the possibility of standing still long enough to fight back. "We served Derek with a restraining order this afternoon," Frank replied. "Official documentation that prohibits him from contacting you, approaching your residence, or interfering with your employment or education. Violation of the order would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges." The practical impact of legal protection extended beyond Anna's immediate safety to encompass the broader question of her future in Millbrook Valley. With official recognition of her right to be free from Derek's harassment, she could begin considering long-term possibilities that had seemed impossible while living it as a fugitive. "But there's something else you need to know," Frank continued, his tone growing cautious. "Derek's not going to accept this quietly. Men like him don't give up just because they receive legal paperwork. If anything, official intervention might trigger more dangerous behavior." The warning echoed Anna's own understanding of her ex-husband's psychology. Derek had never responded well to being told no, and legal restrictions would be seen as challenges to overcome rather than boundaries to respect. The restraining order would provide important protection, but it wouldn't eliminate the threat entirely. "We're prepared for that," Jack said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had characterized his most important decisions. "Anna's not running anymore. and she's not facing this alone. Whatever Derek decides to do next, he'll have to go through all of us to get to her. The statement represented more than personal commitment. It embodied the community response that had evolved around Anna's presence in Millbrook Valley. She had become more than just someone who needed protection. She had become someone worth protecting. A valued member of their social fabric whose welfare mattered to people beyond just Jack and his family. Frank departed after reviewing security protocols and emergency procedures, leaving Jack and Anna to contemplate the implications of their changed circumstances. The passive phase of their relationship was ending, replaced by active engagement with the forces that had driven Anna into hiding. But instead of facing those forces alone, Anna now had allies, resources, and legal recognition of her right to safety. The afternoon brought Tommy and Lily to the cabin for their planned weekend visit, but their usual excitement was tempered by awareness that something significant was happening in the adult world around them. Children had sensitive antennae for tension and change, and both had detected the undercurrents of serious conversation that preceded important family developments. Anna worked to maintain normalcy, engaging the children in their ongoing science project while Jack reviewed security measures and communication protocols. But the artificial separation between childhood innocence and adult reality couldn't be maintained indefinitely, especially when those realities might affect the children's safety and routine. Is the mean man going to try to hurt Anna? Lily asked during a quiet moment, while Tommy was absorbed in measuring and recording the pH levels of lake water samples. Her question was delivered with the matter-of-fact directness that children use to address fears that adults preferred to avoid discussing. Anna knelt beside Lily, recognizing that the child deserved an honest answer that acknowledged reality without creating unnecessary fear. He might try, Anna said gently. But there are a lot of good people working to make sure he can't succeed. Sheriff Harrison, your uncle, Mrs. Collins, and many others are all helping to keep everyone safe. The explanation satisfied Lily's immediate concerns while reinforcing the community support structure that had become central to their defensive strategy. Children needed to understand that safety was a collective responsibility rather than something that depended on any single person's strength or vigilance. Tommy, who had been listening while pretending to focus on his scientific observations, looked up from his notebook with the serious expression he wore during important conversations. If someone tried to hurt Anna, we'd all protect her, right? He asked, his 10-year-old sense of justice demanding confirmation that their family would stand together against external threats. That's right, Jack confirmed, pulling both children close in a gesture that encompassed protection and reassurance. We take care of each other in this family, and Anna is part of our family now. Nobody gets to hurt people we care about. The declaration represented significant evolution in Jack's understanding of their relationship. Anna had progressed from temporary guest to protected resident to valued family member, her integration into their lives complete enough that the children now considered her welfare their responsibility as much as their own. As evening approached and the children settled into the cabin's comfortable routines, Anna found herself experiencing something she had almost forgotten: domestic contentment that wasn't overshadowed by constant fear. The simple pleasure of helping Lily with her homework while Tommy and Jack prepared dinner created a sense of normalcy that felt both foreign and precious after months of transient existence. The tranquility was interrupted by headlights approaching the cabin, an unexpected arrival that immediately triggered defensive responses from all the adults present. But the vehicle that emerged from the darkness was Betty Collins' familiar station wagon, loaded with covered dishes and the maternal authority that she wielded to impose care on families whether they requested it or not. Figured you could use a proper meal on a day like this, Betty announced, bustling into the cabin with the efficiency of someone who had been managing family crises for decades. Frank called and told me about the legal proceedings. Thought you might not have had time to think about dinner. The gesture represented more than simple hospitality. It embodied the community support that had surrounded Anna's integration into Millbrook Valley life. Betty's presence also served a strategic purpose, providing additional adult supervision for the children while Jack and Anna dealt with the emotional and practical implications of their changed circumstances. Over dinner, the conversation naturally turned to plans and possibilities that had been impossible to consider while Anna's status remained precarious. The restraining order provided legal foundation for stability, but the real work of building a sustainable life required decisions about employment, housing, and the long-term structure of her relationship with Jack and the children. The elementary school has an opening for a substitute teacher, Betty mentioned casually, though Anna suspected the information had been researched and confirmed rather than accidentally discovered. Mrs. Peterson specifically asked if you might be interested. Seems Tommy's been telling stories about your teaching methods. The possibility of returning to education represented more than employment opportunity. It offered Anna the chance to reclaim the professional identity that Derek had forced her to abandon. Teaching had been central to her sense of purpose and self-worth, and the prospect of working with children again provided hope for rebuilding the life she had lost. I'd need to update my credentials, pass background checks, complete all the bureaucratic requirements, Anna said, though her tone suggested interest rather than discouragement. And I'm not sure my previous employment references would be helpful, given how I had to leave. Jack reached across the table to touch her hand, a gesture that had become natural during their weeks of shared residence. We'll figure it out, he said with the quiet confidence that had sustained them through the most difficult phases of their defensive preparations. You have allies now, Anna. People who want to help you succeed, not people trying to tear you down. The evening continued with practical discussions about logistics and timelines. But underneath the mundane details of employment applications and housing arrangements, something more significant was taking shape. Anna was transitioning from protected refugee to active community member, from someone whose presence required explanation to someone whose contributions were valued and desired. Later, after Betty had departed, and the children were settled in the cabin's loft, Jack and Anna found themselves alone on the porch, watching the lake reflect stars that seemed closer and brighter than they had during the uncertain weeks of hiding and planning. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, but also the sense of new beginnings that came with successfully navigating a major life transition. Are you ready for what comes next? Jack asked, his voice carrying awareness that their relationship was entering a new phase that would require different kinds of courage and commitment than their defensive alliance had demanded. Anna considered the question seriously, aware that her answer would affect not just her own future but the futures of the children who had begun to depend on her presence and the man who had risked everything to provide her with safety and hope. The woman who had fled across 6 states in search of sanctuary had found something better. A place where she was valued for who she was rather than tolerated as a burden. I'm ready to try, she said finally, her voice carrying the mixture of determination and vulnerability that characterized her approach to possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I'm ready to learn what it feels like to belong somewhere, to build something instead of just surviving. Jack moved closer on the wooden bench, his massive frame radiating the warmth and security that had made Anna feel safe enough to stop running and start hoping. Then let me teach you, he said, echoing the promise that had begun their journey from desperate alliance to genuine partnership. Let me show you what real love feels like when it's built on trust and respect, and the choice to build a life together. The gentle giant's arms encircled the woman who had traveled so far to find home. And in that embrace, 2 people who had been broken by loss and betrayal began the process of creating something new and beautiful together. The lake reflected their silhouettes as they sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the community that had chosen to protect them, and the children who had chosen to love them. 6 months later, Anna stood before her 3rd grade classroom in Millbrook Valley Elementary School, watching 22 eager faces wait for her to begin the day's science lesson. Her credentials had been restored through a combination of legal intervention and community support. Her background investigation had confirmed what everyone who knew her already understood about her character. And her teaching contract represented more than employment. It was official recognition of her place in the community she had come to call home.
Derek Morrison's legal troubles had multiplied exponentially after his confrontation with Sheriff Harrison. The pattern of professional misconduct that had been hidden for years had finally come to light, resulting in disbarment proceedings, criminal charges, and the complete collapse of the authority he had used to terrorize Anna. The man who had once seemed invincible had been revealed as a petty criminal whose power had always been more illusion than reality. Tommy and Lily occupied seats in Anna's classroom now, having requested transfers specifically to be taught by the woman who had become their second mother in all but legal documentation. The wedding was planned for Christmas, a celebration
that would formalize relationships that had been built through crisis and strengthened through community support. Anna's students never knew that their gentle, patient teacher had once been a woman fleeing for her life across multiple states. They only knew that she made learning exciting, that she treated them with respect and kindness, and that she seemed to understand something important about helping people discover their own strength and potential. At recess, Anna stood by her classroom window and watched Jack's construction crew working on the school's new addition, his massive frame visible even from a distance as he supervised the project with the careful attention to safety that characterized all his work. Tommy and Lily played with their classmates in the schoolyard, their laughter carrying across the playground with the joy of children who felt secure in their world. The woman who had once asked desperately what real love felt like had learned the answer through daily experience. Real love was patient protection, community support, children's laughter, and the choice to build something beautiful together despite the forces that work to tear people apart. Real love was Jack Reynolds teaching her that she deserved safety and happiness, and Anna Cooper teaching him that healing was possible even after the deepest losses. As the school bell rang and her students returned to their classroom, Anna smiled with the contentment of someone who had found not just safety, but purpose, belonging, and the kind of love that made all the running and fear worthwhile. The gentle giant had kept his promise, and in teaching her what real love felt like, he had created a family stronger than anything that had tried to destroy it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.